Shalom, my name is Adam Wasser from Brooklyn, New York. On the idea of Judaism and how does it relate to this new modern world we live in. Today, we have science, we have archaeology, we have things like the internet and modern medicine that have never been found in history before. In fact, our generation is more equipped and more capable than any other generation has been in history. We are more educated than any other generation in history. We know more than any generation that has ever come before us. We are overwhelmed with new ideas, new sciences, new patterns of history through archaeology. In fact, we are so overwhelmed with these new methods of life and new ideas and new history patterns of life that we must ask ourselves, are we exactly correct in how we are going? Are we exactly correct in the method in which we are going? Are we going too quickly? You know, today we know that, you take a rock at the Grand Canyon, and it's not just a rock, it's a history lesson of the world. Once upon a time, the Grand Canyon was a coastline. And when you really look at the Grand Canyon in a scientific way, you find that the Grand Canyon is a pattern, a layer of history. We know that dinosaurs existed once upon a time because of archaeology and looking into the ground and what do we find. The world has changed completely to what it once was. And yet religion still exists. And religion is very strong in this world today. And many people in this world today have taken religion and taken it to an extreme of rejecting science, rejecting archaeology, and just basically saying it's not true because we wish not to let go of religion. But here's my thing. Religion, and I'm talking about Judaism here, Judaism and science and archaeology do not conflict. They are different words and different methods of understanding history and the world around us. In fact, when you learn science and you learn about archaeology, you find, and you learn Torah, you find that the two don't really conflict, but they have different words of putting things together. For example, in the Holy Zohar, Kabbalic teaching, we learn that God had an idea in his head. He spoke the idea, and it came out as Hebrew letters. And the Hebrew letters, the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, were held together by the 10 attributes of God. And they created things like you and me, like trees and birds and fish. Now, we've learned in science that once upon a time, molecules and vessels somehow came together, that they just had a big bang, and they formed. Now, these are different words, but they're the same concept. But one is saying it just happened, and the other is saying no, there was a God, there is a God, and that he formed it and put it into play. In Judaism, there is the 7 days of creation. And we learn from Jewish science that can be taught in places like Torah, Yeshiva Torah, that's in Jerusalem, that the 7 days of creation, the 6 days of creation, were actually millions of years. And in these millions of years, dinosaurs existed, and the evolution of the world came about. Now, how does this logic come around? The Hebrew calendar is about almost 6,000 years old. But the interesting thing is that this calendar started by the time that Adam and Eve were created. Before Adam and Eve were created, the first 6 days of creation, these 6 days of creation are not counted in the Hebrew calendar. Only the days after Adam and Eve were created. Why? God doesn't need a calendar. In fact, we learn that God has no time and space. That God is everywhere and at every time. 1,000,000 years to us can be billions of years to God, and vice versa. In fact, we learn from science that when the world was first evolving and creating, that gravity was not as we know it today. In fact, gravity was slower, reduced, which made the world, the time, go slower. And in fact, in the beginning years of time, because of the gravity, the reduction of gravity, 1 day back then could have been, 7 days today. And this is from science. So the idea of Jewish science is that not rejecting modern science, but saying there's something in Judaism about yes, it agrees with science. It's just using different words and different metaphors of understanding how the world was created. In fact, Judaism, when you look at Bereshit, Genesis, it doesn't say the world was flat as was understood in the medieval period. In fact, the Torah mentions the world was round and that there is a center point of the world, and that there's a gravitational push that holds the moon to the earth. Science agrees with this actual concept. It's not something that has come around since the last 50 years, but it is understood that that is the truth today, that there is a center point of the world that holds a gravitational control to the moon, to the earth. Science says that once upon a time all the continents were one, Pangea, and there was one sea. In Genesis, when you look at the details, when you read it, you find that there was also one land surrounded by water. Now, there are stories in the Torah that seem a bit strange, like Noah and the Ark, the Teva, that once upon a time the world was flooded. Well, we know that the world has changed. It's evolved in the millions of years. Now, yes, the Teva, the flood of Noah and Ark, only happened about 5,000 years ago, and these kind of floods that we're talking about are 5 million years ago. But the truth is, the concept is there, the understanding is there. The question is the timeline and the numbers of when it actually happened. Now, I personally believe there was a flood 5,000 years ago from Noah and the Ark, and it flooded the land, and everything was destroyed. My problem with science is that I don't believe the numbers. I do believe the world is millions of years old, definitely. But when it comes to archaeology and them having problems with the numbers of timelines and saying, well, something is not off, is not correct because of I'm dating pottery, I'm dating rocks, and they're not matching up to the exact timeline of the Torah. My argument is that this is a new concept. It's only about 80 years old of this whole idea of how we date things, and it's still evolving and it's still changing. And I say yes, there was a great flood, because we know there were floods, but our timing might not be exact, and that for us to say that we know exactly when flooding happened because we are correct in our timeline, that's very immature of us to think that we are so high and mighty that we are ultimately 100% correct in this idea. There was a woman back around the 1920s actually, and she went to Jericho in Israel, and she had a whole new concept of how to date pottery. And she said, oh, the story of Jericho, it's true, it was destroyed and all this in this way, but it's off by 200 years, because this is how I date the pottery. Come on. What happened there, she totally agrees with, but the time is off by 200 years. So she is the holy one, that she knows exactly that this is how we date pottery, that it's absolutely correct. I find it amazing is that she agrees with how it happened, the destruction of Hatzor and Jericho, but the timing's off by about 200 years. And things like the parting of the Red Sea. The Red Sea, it wasn't a Red Sea, it was the Sea of Reeds, the Yam HaSuf. And we know today that there are areas that separate the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt that had reeds and did adjust its water flow. When we have Jewish science and we take it and we learn and study it, studying the Torah and studying science, we find that these two things relate very much together, and there's very little contradiction. And that's why I'm totally against the idea of rejecting science, of rejecting archaeology. Because if we reject science, if we reject archaeology, we hurt not only the Torah in its understanding, but we hurt ourselves, because we're denying ourselves the truth about Torah. And that the idea of that the Torah is real. At least to me it's real. And for me to understand it, it's more than just, oh, I believe it, and that's it. I want to know the real truth about it all. I want to know the details. I want to know how it all really happened. When we look at miracles of God, we find that most of God's miracles were in a natural way. So let's find out. Let's really get into it. We need to understand science, and we need to absorb it. and learn more in Torah. You know, the Torah sometimes, we have to remember, when the Second Temple was destroyed, the rabbis came together and they said, we need to preserve Judaism, we need to keep it alive, so let's write it down. God was against this. He said, don't write down the laws of Torah, the 613 laws. We wrote it down because we were afraid that we would lose, you know, the Jews were in the diaspora, we needed to save it. And they were right in doing this. But over time, by writing it down, we got stuck in these laws. And laws that, you know, how medieval rabbis looked at these laws are how we follow them today. And we say, oh, it's so medieval, it's so backwards. Because it's not that it's wrong, but it's that we're kind of stuck on what great and holy rabbis said. But it's very important that in Judaism we understand that Torah says, God says, follow the laws the way your rabbis of your generation follow them. So the way the rabbis say we should follow them today is how they followed them in the medieval period. This is the fault of our own selves and our own rabbis, because we haven't moved on to a higher being, a higher level. And you know, we will one day, because it even says when Mashiach comes, when Messiah comes and we rebuild the third temple in Jerusalem, that the laws will change. There's even a law that says that one day pigs will become kosher, that they'll chew their cud and they have the split hooves, and you'll be able to eat pig when Mashiach comes. And there's other things that you know, things are going to change, because we'll understand a higher level of how these laws relate to you and me. But ultimately, this video is about science, archaeology, and Judaism. And how does it relate to you and me? How am I relating to the world as a Jew, as a modern Jew in the modern world, with all these things going on? Well, for me, being a Jew is about my family. It's about my history. It's about my country, Israel, and how I live my life, and God. I've had my down points in life where I've become very secular. I've had my high points where I became very religious. And now I'm kind of like in the middle, stable, somewhere in the middle. And that's because of my own experiences in my own life. I had a lot of bad things that happened to me in the last year, 2 years. And these bad things brought me up and down, but ultimately to a middle level. And I unfortunately find that a lot of times bad things happen for good reasons, because they kind of adjust you, and you can either take it to the good side or take it to the bad side, but ultimately find the middle ground, because that's what life is about. It's a path, a pathway of finding your right path, and that should be a good path. Not saying that you should be secular, but saying that you should understand, not hate, not judge, not go so far as to say, you know, if these Jews are that way, then that's just the wrong path. You yourself, as a Jew, as knowing that your family has its problems, has its pluses and its minuses, but you yourself must be treating people the way you want to be treated, and living in a way that you want everybody else to live. If you want everybody to be on this level, then you yourself have to be on that level. It's not like you know, it's a trial and error. It's not, you're always gonna have problems, but you have to try. You can't say, well, the hell with everything, and I'm not gonna try to understand it, I'm not gonna try to fight it, I'm just going to do whatever and be free. Because life is not about, unfortunately, it's not about being free. Life is struggle. We always have struggle in our lives, and it always strengthens us and makes us stronger. It's unfortunately a benefit to life to struggle. I personally know this from experience, and I think most of us know this, and whether we accept it or not. I know people that have become very secular because of the problems in the world and the problems with themselves and their family, whatever, and a lot of it doesn't have to do with their fault, and they became secular. Or maybe they see religious people and they hate him, so they just want to become secular. And I look at this as the wrong approach. And I've felt this way in the past too. I've been there. I look at it as, we need to look at life and see the reality. We don't know ultimately the truth. We have one side of Torah saying one thing, we have science saying another thing, but when you really study them and you put them together, you find that they coexist. And then you have to ask yourself, does God exist? Is the Torah true? And if it is true, then how should I be living my life? Forget about everybody else. How should I be living my life? Israel, after 2,000 years, is a fact, a reality. It is one of the most successful nations in the world. It is blossomed into an amazing miracle of life. Why? Israel, if anything, is telling you something. It's telling you. Israel is a secular nation. Only 20% of it is religious. But it's saying something. What is it saying? God bless you all. And Mashiach now. Amen.